Hello, everyone. Oh, you can't hear me yet. Hopefully you can hear me now. Let me make sure. Oh, there's a microphone on, so you can hear me now. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to week 3. I appreciate everyone's assignment. I haven't had a chance to grade them all yet, but I appreciate the more in-depth exploration of who you are and why you chose to become a counselor. This will tie into this week pretty significantly because the communication patterns that we share with people largely dictates the type of relationships we have with people. And so what I'm going to do, and what's challenging about this class, what the most frustrating thing about this class is to many students, is a challenge to ingrained, highly habitualized patterns of communication that you have with other people. And so as you step out into this endeavor, if you're a counselor, a lot of your time will be spent in an office or another setting alone with another person or perhaps a group of people. And so it's important especially this class, as we move ahead, that we deeply examine the way we relate to other people. And I'm going to ask each one of you, in the context of this class, to really analyze and become introspective on who you are and how you communicate. This is difficult work. It is difficult to step out of ourselves and look back and see, okay, how am I presenting? This is maybe easier done by recording yourself and then going back and paying attention to mannerisms and characteristics that you exhibit when you're with other people. And you'll be asked to do that. And so it's particularly in supervised experience, and then also in practicum. So you'll have to do quite a few recordings of yourself and reflect on, how you are with people when you're counseling them. And so we're going to first establish a common language before we even meet in person. And this can be very frustrating for some. Some people, and I would say I'd be included in this group, find it pretty challenging and intimidating to work on changing how we are and how we communicate with others, our presence. And that can lead to what's called being in our own head, where we're constantly monitoring ourselves and what we're thinking and what we're doing, and we're not paying attention to the person in front of us. That is fatalistic in counseling. You have to be present. You have to be able to attend to that person that's hurting in front of you. And so there's a skill. This class will probably shake you up and get you thinking, and hopefully have you settle into these new skill sets where you can be present and not be so self-conscious in thinking about your own presentation and think about the person that's in front of you. So if you're doing that, that's called being in your head. And that precludes you from being present. That precludes you from being genuine. It precludes you from empathy. It precludes you from establishing a good rapport, which, as we noted last week, is very fundamental for counseling success. Now, let me go ahead and talk about a few things this week. And the biggest portion of learning for this week, I want you to have two maybe paradigms in your head. And so you may have this skill set of a lay helper. So if you've already been, particularly for those of you who are teachers, those of you who may have been in like a pastoral setting, a youth pastor, or some sort of, maybe faith-based evangelizing setting. Those of you who were maybe mentors or even parents, you may have adopted these ingrained patterns of communication that impede the development of empathy with a client. In other words, they're effective in a setting of a lay helper, but they are not valuable in a professional helping relationship as a counselor. So for instance, I did this today. I heard somebody talk about their wife who got a very bad case of COVID, who had to spend a week in ICU. And so I wasn't in a counseling mode. I was in a friend mode. I was in a friendship orientation with this person. And when they told me this, I said, I'm so sorry. And that's common courtesy. That's common courtesy in our culture is when we hear bad news from somebody, if we're just passing along the street or it's in conversation, it's expected to say, oh, I'm so sorry. So sorry to hear that. Rather than say that, that's a characteristic of a lay helper. That communicates to that other person. It communicates that you feel sorry for them. It communicates sympathy. Because if you feel sorry yourself, you're feeling sympathy for them because you're feeling sorry. That's different. That's not empathy. Empathy is when you try to imagine what that person, or you're imagining what that person is feeling. And you say, well, I am, because I'm saying I'm sorry. No, but you, by expressing the sorrow, are being sympathetic. Sympathetic shuts down communication. Sympathetic basically solves your problem of feeling, oh, I feel bad for this person. But yet it doesn't solve that person's problem. That's who we need to focus on when we're communicating. And so rather than say, I'm sorry, there are some other things that you might do when you hear bad news. That sounds really challenging. That sounds really scary. What's the difference in that? What's the difference between that sounds overwhelming? What's the difference in saying that and saying I'm sorry? You're communicating empathy, because if you're saying that sounds really scary, that sounds terrifying, you're connecting with that person's mirror neurons, where you're connecting on that level that, oh, wow, they kind of understand what this might be. Rather than I'm sorry shuts it down. It's okay to continue saying you're sorry. And, if you go to a funeral of somebody, that's okay. That's a social interaction. But when you're in the counseling chair, I'm sorry is off limits for the most part. I mean, if you slip every once in a while, but it hinders empathy, and it hinders the relationship. You want them to be able to express. So I wasn't in a situation where I was prepared to listen to this person. This person was actually providing treatment to me. And so I'm not going to try to do a counseling session with them. And so I did say, after they described more, I said, that sounds terrifying. And I used some of my counseling because it's ingrained. Or I might try to paraphrase or even reflect. Your wife spent a week in ICU. And I might leave it right there. And that creates a space for that person to project into whatever they want to project. So a lot of what I'm going to be asking you to do in this class will be creating a space for that other person to project into. where it's not about you, it's not about your feelings of sympathy or your own, internal state. It's about allowing that person to project into where you'll be able to understand them better, and for them to emote, for them to be able to disclose their emotions through their story. Another thing that we tend to do as lay helpers is we tend to self-disclose. This is very, very common. Well, you know what I would do? I would force my way into that ICU room and be there with my spouse, because that's not fair that they're keeping you out. What does that do? That's about you. That has no place in the counseling session in this context. Now, self-disclosure is not always bad, but it needs to be used very sparingly. We'll talk about situations where it's appropriate, but it's, for the most part in this class, it's not appropriate. Let's focus on that being the next class. We're breaking down bad habits. So a lot of people come in and self-disclose instead of listening. I would have felt completely overwhelmed. I would have felt, why? Why do you need to say that? So let's think about different ways of responding. So reflecting, like I said, your wife spent a week in ICU. Or amplifying feelings. That sounds completely overwhelming and scary. Saying, I know how you feel. This one time, I was with my dad and they wouldn't let me into the ICU room, and he was bleeding to death. And I remember how bad I felt. Like, well, I'm showing empathy. I'm showing how I know how that person feels. It's not about you. You're about learning about them. That becomes a bad habit. And so I'm trying to break bad habits. And so while this may have been helpful to you in other situations, we're trying to break bad habits in this class. We never truly know the depths of feelings of another person. But the more we are silent and listen, the less we make the situation about ourselves and our own experience, the more we're able to learn about the thoughts, feelings, and inner beliefs of our clients. And so if I were counseling this person, tell me more about what happened. Tell me more about what you were thinking. So you're inviting this person to project into a space rather than you filling it. I would say that's going to, if we looked at an overarching theme of this class, don't fill the space. You allow the client to fill the space. That'll be difficult when you start. Many of you will find difficulty with that, particularly if you're a teacher. If we're not teaching, we're not learning, right? Yeah. And we're not helping people learn. I'm going to argue that in silence, people are learning. People are making connections for themselves. While we talk, other people have to process our words, and they're not forming new connections. So be aware of that, especially when people are dealing with emotions they've not dealt with. You want them to make those connections. And silence is often a good way to allow them to be in that space. Another thing that I've noticed is people are uncomfortable with emotional pain of others. That, first of all, that I'm sorry thing kind of reflects that. Our society, we want to fix things really quickly. Just pray about it, you'll feel better. Or just do this. If you just do this, just straight giving advice, that's down later. It's a sign you're not comfortable with emotional pain. I've seen a lot of counselors change the subject when clients bring up difficult topics. Gosh, my wife is still having trouble breathing after all this. Well, tell me a little bit about your daughter. I've heard beginning students do that because they, and possibly even inadvertently, but they don't know where to go with that emotional pain. I'm going to ask you to be okay with sitting with the pain with that person. So we change the focus of the session to something more superficial. Cheerleading. Cheerleading is a really common, because we want to help, we want to fix. You're so good at this, you've got this. It sounds like a friend, right? You got this. Things will turn out good if you just put your mind to it. Again, when people cheerlead, to me, it's not being okay with that emotional pain or uncertainty. Or maybe this person really doesn't believe that they can do it. Well, see, that's why I'm telling them. I'm telling them they can do it because nobody's ever told them that. But that's not our role. We're not a life coach. We're a counselor. And if we occasionally give praise for something that we know they've worked on, that was a hard step for you. What does that sound like versus you can do this, you got this? That person recognizes that they did it and it was a hard step. These things will make sense and will emerge as we go through. You might hang on to this sheet, particularly when we meet in class live. Problem solving. I've heard students ask open-ended questions, but almost like 20 questions trying to solve problems. And a lot of these problems are intractable problems, like ongoing relational problems with parents or partners or children. And we focus so much time on trying to solve problems, we miss that person's feeling. And that person's better at solving their problems than we are because they're their own expert. They've lived in their life, in their skin for all these years, not us. We will eventually work on this problem solving, but not this semester. We're not going to solve problems this semester. We're going to listen. It's going to be frustrating for a lot of you. Advice giving. Just stop. Isn't that supposed to be what we do as counselors, is give advice? People come to us because we're the experts. So we give them the advice and what they're supposed to do. Not in this class. We're breaking bad habits. We're learning new ways to feel and learning new ways to have people feel and go deeper into their emotions. Lay helpers want to fix problems. This is the #1 common trait I see in beginning students. There are several problems with this. A few of them are intertwined in the things we already mentioned. Girl, you just need to dump him. You're better than he is. Your life will be so much better. What's the problem with the counselor saying that? Overidentification and self-disclosure. I alluded to this earlier. When I lost my job, I got right out there and began applying for new jobs immediately. You need to get out there and start talking to people that, the employers, the bosses. Get right out there. Well, that may have worked for you. There may be things in this person's life where that doesn't work. Number one, it inhibits deep exploration of problems. And by you just over-identifying, they don't connect with what's going on with themselves emotionally. They don't fully disclose the extent of the problem. And you're cutting off your empathy. This can be a big, this over-identification. I asked the question why people got in this field. And so this to me is countertransference. Regardless of how similar your situation might be to that of your client, you are not your client. What worked for you very well may not work for them. You may think this is the magic panacea that will fix this problem because it worked in my life. Particularly those of you, this is difficult. This is something I've studied a lot, particularly those of you who have been through traumas. Every trauma is different in every person. We have some similar ways that we react to trauma. Every person has their own unique response. And so, particularly when you run into a situation that's eerily similar, and you will, to something you've encountered, it's an extra special time to take a step back and listen to your client and not project yourself into the space where your client needs to be projecting into. Listen to understand. Don't listen to fix, especially this class. And clients are much more likely to own solutions they formulate rather than those proposed by others. So rather than you giving that advice that worked for you, they're more likely to own something that they came up with and that you supported. I talked about this, being in one's head. These would be common things that we work with throughout the semester and that you'll battle through in class and reflect on outside of class. I hope this video was helpful. You can go back and reflect on this if you need to more than once. Otherwise, pay attention to what we've got on the discussion board this week, and I look forward to reading your stuff. Take care.